Hi, everyone. I'm Nandini.
Hi, everyone. I'm Brendan. So this talk will be on the concept and the theory of imperialism. So I'll be taking the first part of the talk. I'll be discussing the concept of the definition of imperialism, and then Nandini will go into the theory, the economic theory of imperialism a little bit more. Since most of my part of the talk will be on what imperialism is, I won't start by giving a definition. Instead, I'm just going to dogmatically quote Lenin on the importance of imperialism. Lenin wrote this in the preface to Bukharin's Imperialism and World Economy. And he said there that the problem of imperialism is not only a most essential one, but we may say it is the most essential problem in that realm of economic science which examines the changing forms of capitalism in recent times. Everyone interested not only in economics, but in any sphere of present-day social life must acquaint themselves with the facts relating to this problem. So the contention of this talk is that this statement is just as true for today as it was then. And hopefully over the course of the talk, we'll make this view plausible to you as well. Okay, so my part of the talk will deal with the definition of imperialism, again, opposed to the economic theory of imperialism. So this is the rough plan for today. So I'm going to start by outlining the Red Ant / Lenin definition of imperialism. I'll take a look at some competing definitions of imperialism, and then I'll give an argument for why we ought to prefer the Lenin definition. And then Nandini will look over three, let's say, contemporary mechanisms of imperialism that exist in the literature on imperialism today. Because my part of the talk is on the definition of imperialism, I think it's important to distinguish between two things, definitions and theories. So on the way that I'll be using these terms here, a definition expresses the characteristic features of a thing that allow us to identify the thing and differentiate it or individuate it from other things. So the function of a definition is to indicate what it is we're talking about, what the thing under investigation is. It's a matter of pointing to a phenomenon and not anything else. A theory, on the other hand, is meant to be an explanation of some phenomenon. So it's meant to be an account of the mechanisms which produce and sustain, or at least govern the development or change of that phenomenon over time. So for instance, evolution is the change of organisms over time, and then the theory of evolution by natural selection is an account of the mechanisms and governing laws of that change. Definition identifies a phenomenon and a theory explains it. So when it comes to imperialism, as I'll try to show in my part of the talk, the core disagreements, they do not take place on the level of theory, in my view. They tend to take place on the level of definition. So there is a substantial amount of disagreement about what it is we are even talking about when we talk about imperialism, which is a very different type of disagreement to a theoretical disagreement about the structure, causes, and governing laws of imperialism. So this is going to be an incredibly pedantic talk, and it sort of has to be because there is a significant amount of confusion, in my view, about the word imperialism. I think there's a significant amount of what I'll call semantic shift in the term imperialism, especially when figures on the Marxist left debate imperialism. So, for instance, it's almost everybody recognizes that, for instance, the American wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, some form of American imperialism, but there's ambiguity about whether imperialism is an action, is something that a state does, or is it a structure that underlies those actions, whether that be an economic or a political structure or something else. The consequences of this is that, you know, in the literature on Marxist theories of imperialism, there's just a sort of reticence to define the phenomenon under investigation. So Anthony Brewer, in his sort of standard survey of Marxist theories of imperialism, he just sort of forgoes the possibility of defining imperialism at all. And he says that instead he'll just follow the way that the different thinkers he's talking about use the term, while admitting that they use the term differently. So in our view, there are significant political consequences to this sort of conceptual ambiguity. So the Marxist left, especially in the so-called Western world, it finds itself in this contradictory situation where on the one hand, there is an intense debate about which countries are imperialist, whether China is imperialist or not, for example. And then on the other hand, there is next to no high-level discussion about what imperialism actually is in terms of its definition, such that we could explain why a country is imperialist and not just that it is imperialist. So given this situation, the first part of this talk, which is my part, has three aims. So in the first place, I'm going to be making a case that much of the disagreement about imperialism in the Marxist left occurs at the level of concepts and definitions and not at the level of theory. And then I'll try to provide a definition of imperialism that is sufficiently determinate, such as to make possible answers to concrete questions about which countries are imperialist and why, and the sort of the flesh of that will come through in the second half of the talk. And then thirdly, I'm going to argue that our definition is preferable to other available definitions. So I'm going to begin with the red ant or Lenin definition of imperialism, which is as follows. Imperialism in the contemporary era refers to the division of the world into two regions, one that is oppressed and one that oppresses. So this is the phenomena that we are concerned with when we talk about imperialism. And moreover, this is the phenomena that we think Lenin was concerned with when he spoke about imperialism. And that may sound sort of unusual because normally when people talk about Lenin's theory of imperialism, they talk about the theory of monopoly capitalism. And that's certainly true, but this is, in my view, to run together the definition of the phenomena with the theory. So the theory of monopoly capitalism is Lenin's theory of imperialism, which means that it is his theory that explains the phenomenon of imperialism. The definition of imperialism is something very different to that. So it's the difference between asking the question, what does the term imperialism refer to, and what is explained by my theory of imperialism. So my contention to here is that the meaning of the word imperialism for Lenin is the division of the world into two regions, one that is oppressed and one that oppresses. And I think that we can sort of uncontroversially dispose of this question just on the basis of textual evidence. I'm not going to read out every single one of these quotes, but it's just it's very obvious throughout Lenin's corpus that when he uses the term imperialism, he uses it to mean this. So for instance, he says, imperialism consists in a striving of nations that oppress a number of other nations to extend and increase that oppression. That's the second to last quote. And in fact, the most important quote, he says straightforwardly, it is the division of nations into oppressor and oppressed which forms the essence of imperialism. You can take a look at the other quotes here. I've just selected four. He uses this definition constantly. And moreover, according to Lenin, these nations are oppressed because they are exploited. So for instance, he says, imperialism is the exploitation of hundreds of millions by a handful of very rich nations, or the exploitation of oppressed nations, and especially the exploitation of colonies by a handful of great powers, increasingly transforms the civilized world into a parasite on the body of hundreds of millions. So this is the concrete world situation that Lenin's theory of imperialism was intended to explain. So the point that I want to make is this, that it's entirely possible today to agree with Lenin that the essence of imperialism is the division of the world into oppressed and oppressor nations, but to disagree with him on the mechanism that makes this so. So this would be to agree with Lenin's definition of imperialism while rejecting his theory of imperialism. And as we'll see in the second part of this talk, there are many contemporary Marxist theories of imperialism which take this route. They agree that imperialism is a matter of the division of the world into oppressed and oppressor nations, but they disagree that monopoly capitalism is the explanation for that phenomenon. All that I'm arguing for in my part of the talk is that this is the correct way that we ought to think about and define imperialism. So at this point, I'd like to compare our definition of imperialism with a few different definitions of imperialism. So in particular, I'd like to compare our definition with the definition that we find in socialist alternative statement of principles. The point here is not to sort of polemicize or denigrate this definition, but instead I want to compare the two definitions for two reasons. So first, because we consider the SALT way of defining and talking about imperialism as let's say, broadly representative of a dominant way of thinking about imperialism in the Marxist left especially, but also broadly. We'll see sort of later that, in my view, the SALT definition of imperialism falls into a certain class of definitions which are very common. And the second reason is because it is widespread, and because it is a plausible and way of thinking about imperialism that many people hold. I think it's sort of incumbent upon us to state our theoretical disagreements with this definition. Because if we don't do that, then we cannot have productive disagreements. So Salt's definition is as follows. The core element of imperialism is the conflict between imperial powers or blocks of capital, which attempt by military, diplomatic, and commercial means to divide and redivide the world in their own interests. So it should be immediately obvious that this definition differs from ours. What I want to stress here is just how different it is and the way in which it is different. And my idea is that this definition is not just different from ours in sort of minor details, but according to it, imperialism is a categorically different kind of thing than under the Lenin conception of imperialism. So when I say categorically different, I mean, according to these two definitions, imperialism is a different kind of thing. I'll break this down in detail, so forgive me. So you'll notice in the first place that the SALT definition identifies being an imperial power with being a block of capital. So they say imperial power is all blocks of capital. So given this, imperialism refers to the way in which blocks of capital tend to behave, namely that they enter into conflict with one another. But if this is so, then imperialism refers to a feature or a property of blocks of capital or a characteristic of blocks of capital. So in particular, imperialism refers to the following property, that blocks of capital have a tendency to come into conflict with one another. And you get my gloss on this definition. So imperialism, according to SALT, is a property of blocks of capital, namely the tendency of blocks of capital to enter into conflict with one another. But the Red Ant definition does not refer to imperialism as a property or a feature or a characteristic of capital. In effect, refers to imperialism as a certain kind of social structure, a worldwide social structure. And what this means is that Red Ant and SALT, they do not just disagree on their respective theories of imperialism or have minor disagreements in their definition of the word imperialism, but they disagree on the basic meaning of the word imperialism. For the tendency of capital is a different kind of thing than a social structure. So to compare the two would be, in my view, to be like comparing the behavior of an individual capitalist or an individual block of capital with the whole structure of capitalism. And I suppose one important point is that it is possible for one and the same country to be imperialist under one definition and not imperialist under another. So for instance, take China, for example. Let's say that China does represent a certain block of capital, and just in virtue of the fact that it does represent that block of capital, it enters into relations of conflict with other blocks of capital. That would make it an imperialist country under the SALT definition. But let's say at the same time that China is an overall exploited country in the sense that there is a net transfer of surplus value out of China and into, say, the first world countries. That would make China at the same time an imperialist country under the SALT definition and not an imperialist country under the Red Ant definition. In fact, it would make it a victim under the Red Ant definition. So I'll return to this point shortly. The point is just to stress how different these two definitions are. Now, as a point of comparison, I'd like to introduce a third definition of imperialism that we find in a sort of a more academic context. So this is Patrick Bond's definition, which we find in his edited collection, which discusses the so-called BRICS countries and the concept of sub-imperialism. So this is the way that he defines imperialism in that book. So he says, to define sub-imperialism properly implies a coherent definition of the systematic process of imperialism within which it operates. Okay. There are a variety of ways to understand imperialism, but the most durable appears to be the conception which Rosa Luxemburg set out in The Accumulation of Capital in 1913, stressing the extra economic coercion associated with exploitation between capitalist and non-capitalist spheres under conditions of capitalist crisis. So this is not explained in the definition, but the extra economic coercion referred to here it's not entirely extra economic. It's not sort of apropos of nothing, because it has an economic base according to Luxemburg's theory. So the idea is that the imperialism arises out of the requirements of capital accumulation, and in particular, the fact that capital requires expansion into non-capitalist regions, both to secure markets for its surplus, as well as for opportunities to capitalize its surplus value, according to Luxemburg's theory. So given that, we can sort of gloss the Bond definition as follows. Imperialism is the extra economic coercion that arises as a result of the requirements of capital accumulation. So I want to look at the way in which this definition is, in fact, very similar to Salt's definition. So the first thing I think we should note again is that both of these definitions portray imperialism as a categorically different kind of thing than the Red Ant definition. Both of them, again, reduce imperialism to a property of blocks of capital or capital itself. So this is sort of where my argument gets a little bit tricky. But the point that I just sort of want people to keep in mind is that under both of these definitions, imperialism is defined as sort of an expression of the inner nature of capital itself. And insofar as that is common to both of these definitions, my view is that these definitions fall into a class of definitions of imperialism. And I call that class of definitions of imperialism, following a comment by Uttam Prabhat Patnaik, functional definitions of imperialism. So a functional definition of imperialism, on my view and on, in response to what they say, is any definition according to which imperialism necessarily follows from some aspect of the nature of capital itself. It's a function of capital in that sense. So in the Salt definition, for example, imperialism follows from the tendency of blocks of capital to come into conflict. In Bond's case, imperialism follows from the requirements of capital accumulation. So what is important, and this is the upshot of all of this really pedantic stuff, what is important is that given any functional definition of capital, every capitalist country will automatically count as an imperialist country. So this is sort of the direction that I'm heading in, and I'll return to this point shortly. So now, however, I want to ask the following question. Given that there are two definitions which are so different, such that they're not even incompatible with one another, but merely different, how are we to decide between them? So how are we to decide between the Red Ant or Lenin definition and the Salt one? And I want to acknowledge that there's always a certain danger in sort of debating and discussing definitions in this sense, because there's always the possibility that we just simply talk past one another. If I define a phenomenon in one way and you define it in another, we're simply just, talking about different things at the end of the day. And one of us cannot be correct or incorrect about their definition in that case. But there are sort of 2 points I want to make in response to this. So first, and this is the really important thing, the definition is not the important thing at the end of the day. It's rather the phenomenon that the definition is intended to express. And I'll get into that more a little bit. But the second point is that even though deciding between definitions is tricky, I think that there is sort of some uncontroversial criteria we can use to decide whether a definition is good or not. And on that basis, I will suggest to you that the Red Ant/Lenin definition is the one that we should prefer. Surprise, yeah, I know, shocking stuff. So I'll take the first point first. I say a definition is not ultimately important for the following reason. So whether we call the division of the world into oppressor and oppressed nations imperialism is sort of, in the final analysis, irrelevant. And that is because, irrespective of what we call it, the world is so divided. This is, in our view, an overwhelmingly evidenced fact. And sort of any analysis of the structure of global capitalism that does not take into account this fact will be lacking in that respect. So the idea is that the world economy is not a homogeneous mass composed of, let's say, qualitatively identical blocks of capital that just sort of relate to one another externally. Global capitalism is a structured whole, and there are relations of domination which obtain between its regions. This is something that will be sort of given a bit of substance in the second half of this talk. And this is sort of what I want the main takeaway of my part to be. It's that whatever the differences between the various socialist parties on the definition of imperialism, we use the term imperialism to focus on that specific reality of the division of the world into oppressor and oppressed nations. But coming to the second point, I do think that we have a few very good reasons to refer to the reality of world polarization as imperialism. So normally a definition has two good components. In the first place, a definition has to capture the way in which people use the term, obviously. And in that sense, I've tried to show that this is the way that just Lenin uses the term. And we are to understand the tradition that emerges from Lenin uses the term in the same way. But there is another criterion which I think we can use to distinguish a good from a bad definition. And that is that if a concept is well defined, it should have some sort of distinct content. It should be such that it is distinguishable from other concepts, in a sense that it would be informative to say that something falls under this concept as opposed to falling under another concept. And that's very abstract, but we'll go through it slowly. So I said at the beginning of this presentation that one of the goals of this was to provide a definition of imperialism that can allow us to answer concrete questions on the Marxist left about which countries are imperialist, whether China or India or whatever is imperialist, and why they're imperialist. So the question then, from the perspective of the SALT or the Patrick Bond definition, is are these definitions the kind of definitions that can allow us to resolve such disputes? And my answer is that they are, only at the cost of making the entire debate completely trivial. What I mean by this is if you adopt one of these definitions, if you adopt the functional definition of imperialism, as I said before, it automatically makes every capitalist country an imperialist country. So recall that a functional definition of imperialism is any definition according to which imperialism follows from some aspect of the nature of capital. So given such a definition of this kind, any capitalist country will be imperialist necessarily. Because if imperialism is a product of the nature, or let's say the inner dynamic of capital, then any country, insofar as it is a capitalist country, will of course be imperialist, just in virtue of the fact that it is a capitalist country. So there's no question on conceptions like these, whether China or India or Brazil or whatever is an imperialist country or not. That is automatically implied in the definition of there being capitalist countries in the first place. So there's no wonder that people who hold what I'm calling functional definitions of imperialism think that these countries are imperialist, right? That follows from the way that they think about and they define the term imperialism. So let's really drive the point home by talking about the SALT definition. So remember that the SALT definition says that imperialism is a tendency of blocks of capital to come into conflict with one another. So obviously, if that is what imperialism is, then any country, insofar as it represents a block of capital at all, will have a tendency to come into conflict with other blocks of capital and will, for that reason, under the SALT definition, automatically be imperialist. So China and India are automatically imperialist under these sort of conceptions of imperialism. So the point that I want to stress, though, is that this isn't just a consequence of the SALT view. This is a result of any definition which is a functional definition of imperialism. Any definition of imperialism which makes imperialism follow from the nature of capital itself automatically makes any capitalist country imperialist. And I think this is a very, very big problem for a few reasons. The first and most obvious reason is that it no longer makes imperialism an informative concept. So if imperialism does follow from the nature of capital itself, such that any capitalist country is imperialist, there's nothing added to the explanation of a situation by calling a country imperialist. Because whatever is added to an explanation by calling a country imperialist will have already been added by calling a country capitalist. So there's no qualitative difference on these conceptions between, on the one hand, let's say, French, British, or American imperialism, and then on the other hand, a hypothetical, Bangladeshi or Indonesian or like Ghanaian imperialism or something like this. And there's a sense in which, for me, this is sort of the point of these definitions, because they effectively shut down the possibility of drawing a structural distinction between the countries of the global north and the countries of the global south. Because under this class of definitions, they will, simply in virtue of being capitalist countries, be either outright imperialist or at least implicitly imperialist. And the idea is that if they do not behave in an obviously imperialist way immediately, that is because of some external circumstances which prevent them from being so. So all countries are implicitly imperialist, at least. And it sort of makes sense to me, therefore, that the people who tend to define imperialism in this way, and whether that be SALT or Patrick Bond or other sort of premier Marxist intellectuals that I haven't had time to speak about, like David Harvey, Giovanni Righi, or as I've put here, Antonio Negri and Michael Hart. These people, they prefer not to talk about oppression between nations at all, and in fact they prefer to talk about the complexity of capitalist flows or the dynamism of the world system or the the way in which empire manages hybrid identities, flexible hierarchies, and plural exchanges through modulating networks of command, as you can see from Hart and Negri here. So this is the problem, right? On conceptions like these, the possibility that there could be relations of domination between regions is sort of defined out of the picture from the beginning. So in my view, there's on the one hand a political reason as well as a conceptual reason that we ought to prefer a definition like red ants. There's a conceptual reason because there is no point in referring to this or that country as imperialist under the SALT definition or the Patrick Bond definition. A political reason because, as we'll see in the second part of this talk, there is very, very plausibly a structural difference between the countries of the global north and the global south. And it is therefore politically important to have a concept which registers that structural difference. And for us at Red Ants, I think imperialism is a good candidate for such a concept. All right, you've nearly had enough of me. So I'm just going to summarize what I've sort of argued in my half, and then I'll turn over to Nandini. So to summarize what we've covered so far, began by outlining the red ant Leninist definition of imperialism, which concerned the division of the world into oppressed and oppressor nations. I then took a look at two alternative definitions of imperialism from Salt and Patrick Bond, and I argued, one, that they constituted categorically different definitions of imperialism than red ant, and two, that they fell into a single class of definitions, which is what I called functional definitions of imperialism. I then argued that any definition of this kind automatically entails that every capitalist country will be imperialist, at least implicitly. And because of that, we have good conceptual and political reasons for rejecting that whole class of definitions. So I'll turn over to Nandini, who will now talk about the reality of the division between global north and global south countries.
Hello, hi everyone, and hi everyone on Zoom as well. You'll find that Brendan's part of the talk was very finely argued and very precise, but my part of the talk is going to be condensing like 1,000-page books into like 15 minutes. So hopefully I can still be a little bit precise as well. But I think the first thing to touch on is that Brendan and I have had long discussions about where the empirical evidence fits into our talk. And Brendan's talked about the importance of the definition fitting into the empirical evidence. And we have this anxiety that we're going to seem too abstract. And we're just talking purely on the conceptual or theoretical level. So we just wanted to show you this meme. And we think that it puts it quite straightforwardly. So if you look at any world indicator, it's going to kind of look like this meme. I have a little bit of problems with this because it does a little bit of like America apologizing. Like you can see that the USA is like a little bit worse than Canada. Boohoo, things are a little bit harder for them. So if we take the world indicators of GDP per capita, so what we have here is quite an interesting IMF diagram, actually, because the categories, if you look at them, they go under 500, 500 to 2,500, and then the lightest blue is 10,000. Oh.
I think the projector's just.
Sorry, we've just had an in-person problem, so give us a moment. All right, so everyone online, we are back up. I'm going to pretend like nothing just happened. And I was talking about a meme, and I was talking about this particular version of that meme, which is these IMF stats. And these IMF stats kind of belie a reality, which is that the very highest category is 25,000 or more GDP per capita. Now, we know for a fact that Australia and the United States doesn't have 25,000 or more. They have like 40,000 to 50,000 GDP per capita, right? So when the second category down is 10,000 to 25,000, but the very highest category includes people who are 50,000 GDP per capita in US dollars. This is just quite a funny ideological graph to me, but it's part of the meme, so I put it in there. if we looked at the indicator of the share of informal employment across the world. Now, informal employment, for anyone who doesn't know, it includes anyone who is employed but does not have any labor rights. So if they don't have any, governing body who's going to look after them, they can't sue their boss if something goes wrong. They don't have a formal contract. So it's frankly, it's horrifying if you look at this. Some of these countries, a lot in Asia, a lot in Africa, have between 75% to like 100% informal employment. This is not like casuals. These are not people who are on literal contracts, So it is quite a horrifying state of the economy. If you just look at this for like 5 seconds, if you look at the material footprint of nations, the high-income countries have absolutely the biggest material footprints because they are the people who are consuming everything that is produced for us by other countries. So yes, what we're talking about, it might seem quite abstract. We're talking about oppressed and oppressor, but there's clearly a division in the world. And these are just indicators. I'd seriously take any indicator and you will find that the world is divided, and it is divided along the same country lines that it has been divided across for the last 150 years. There has been no change. There's like 10 countries that have good material conditions, Australia included, and that has simply not changed across time. So the thing is that you can't just look at these indicators. By themselves, statistics don't really mean anything. Like you can't say, oh, well, this is obviously the world is oppressed and oppressor. Like you need to be able to bring these statistics and systematize them into a theory. And you need to point to how exactly these structures are produced and reproduced every single day, and how exactly they are produced on a global scale. So that is the project of a theory of imperialism, is to actually say, okay, here's how the world is. And here is why the world is that way. And that would make it a good theory of imperialism. So as a point of transition, part of this talk, I want to introduce a diagram that we've been developing. And this is an incomplete attempt to map the space of possibilities when it comes to contemporary imperialism. So we start at the top with Lenin's general definition of imperialism, which is the division of nations into oppressed and oppressors. And then we ask, okay, so along what lines can they be divided? They can be divided politically or culturally or ecologically, and obviously these all are interrelated. But today we're going to be talking about how the world is divided economically into economically oppressed and economically oppressor nations. So then we ask, how is it? And what are the structural features of the world economy that could produce this world polarization? So we're going to look today at income deflation, which is a theory that's put forward by Prabhat and Utsa Patnaik. We ran out of time to talk about super exploitation, but it's available in the works of Jason Hickel, right? No.
Super exploitation.
Yeah.
No, John Smith and
Andy Higginbottom, sorry. John Smith and Andy Higginbottom. We're looking at monopoly capital, which has a really long tradition through Lenin, obviously, but today we're going to be looking at Sam King. And finally, Unequal Exchange by Argyri Emanuel. Do you mind doing Sam's part?
Yeah, I can do Sam's part.
So I have been a little bit sick and my voice is going to die at some point. So I'm going to let Brendan do a little bit of the speaking instead and pass it back to him. But you will hear from me again.
Yep.
So we're going to start off with Lenin's theory of monopoly capitalism.
So normally when you hear about Lenin's theory of imperialism, it's often introduced by means of the 5 basic features. That's the term he uses. The 5 basic features of imperialism that he outlines in Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capital. And there's accompanying this, there's often a sort of a incorrect reduction of Lenin's theory to one of these features. So for instance, you see characterizations of Lenin's theory according to which imperialism has to do essentially with the export of capital or with the emergence of finance capital. In fact, these are explications of the core concept of Lenin's theory, which is the concept of monopoly capitalism. So Lenin is expressly clear on this point, as he writes in chapter 10 of Imperialism, the highest stage of capital. In its economic essence, imperialism is monopoly capital. So interpreted in this way, some writers have thought that Lenin's theory is sufficiently flexible to also account for contemporary imperialism. So 100 years after, Lenin wrote this book. And in our view, the author who gives the best argument for the contemporary relevance of Lenin's theory is Sam King. So for King, the essential feature of contemporary monopoly capitalism is the monopolization of the product of certain kinds of labor processes, and in particular, technically advanced labor processes. So this is in distinction from sort of the traditional picture of monopoly as a monopoly over certain kinds of natural resources. So the model is, I own all of the silver mines, you can't get any of the silver, so I can, charge you a higher price because you have to buy from me. In contrast to this sort of traditional model, monopoly control over the product of certain labor processes expresses itself in one of two possible forms, which come from Marx. So in the first place, it can be control of the capacity to produce the same commodities as one's competitors, but to do it at a cheaper rate per unit of labor. And this one is especially important in my view, it can come with the capacity to produce commodities that others either cannot produce at all or can only produce slowly or with great difficulty. So capitals which command labor processes with these capacities can sell the product of that labor with a markup because the cost of production of these commodities will be higher for those capitals that do not command or that do not control labor processes with the same level of technical advancement. And the important point here is that these two capacities which make monopoly possible presuppose labor processes with a degree of technical superiority to other labor processes. So all other things being equal, it's only possible for certain labor processes to produce standard commodities more cheaply per unit of labor. That's the first one. Or for them to produce certain commodities that others cannot at all. That's the second one. If the labor process employs a different technique for the production of those commodities. So the technical superiority of a certain labor process is the basis for both possible forms of monopoly control. So King, following the heterodox economic literature, calls the kind of technically superior labor that makes monopoly possible sophisticated labor, to be contrasted with ordinary labor, which does not enjoy any sort of technical superiority vis-a-vis other labor processes. I think it's probably better to use the terms sophisticated and ordinary labor processes, just in order to stress that it's the labor process and not sort of the intrinsic quality of the labor, which is at issue here. So when King uses this term sophisticated labor process, he has in concrete terms in mind things like product design as opposed to product manufacture, global logistics and procurement operations, things like marketing techniques, advanced marketing techniques, which involve some sort of psychological manipulation, that sort of stuff. And by ordinary labor, he means bulk production, the production of the term in the heterodox literature is like undifferentiated commodities. These are commodities which are easily producible given a certain standard of production. So things like sewing, things like assembling electronics as opposed to their design, that sort of stuff. But it's important to note, as I mentioned before, sophisticated and ordinary labor processes, they don't map one of the categories of skilled and unskilled labor. And instead, the categories, they're sort of defined by their conditions of reproduction. In the sense that a sophisticated labor process is a labor process which is difficult to produce in the sense that it has some significant barrier of entry. That's in fact essential for technically superior labor processes to command monopoly prices for their products. Because if a certain technically superior labor process were reproducible easily by any capital, then in fact it would be reproduced and there would be no basis for the monopoly prices that the products of that sort of labor would command. So there's a sense in which superior always implies superior to other possible or hypothetical processes. And I wonder, maybe Sam will reject this way of putting the matter, but I want to say that certain labor processes are not difficult to reproduce because they are technically advanced. Rather, technically advanced means, in a certain sense, difficult to reproduce, because advanced is always relative to other possible production processes. So a sophisticated labor process is a technically superior labor process that is difficult to reproduce, whereas an ordinary labor process is defined as a technically standard labor process that is easily reproducible. And the idea is that the products of sophisticated labor processes command monopoly prices, and the products of ordinary labor do not command monopoly prices. Now, in King's theory, these two categories of labor, they give rise to two different categories of capital. So capital that controls sophisticated labor processes is called monopoly capital, and capital that controls ordinary labor processes is called non-monopoly capital. So if we consider at the level of the world economy, exchange between the block of capital that represents monopoly capital and the block of capital that represents non-monopoly capital, it follows that there will be systematically unequal terms of trade between these two blocks of capital, because the monopoly capital can command monopoly prices, which means it sells its product at a rate in excess of the surplus value embodied in its products, right? And because it's a closed system, because there's only a certain amount of surplus value to go around, if the monopoly capital is getting more value for its products than it ought to, then that means the non-monopoly capital is getting less value than it ought to. And this difference in, or put it this way, the transfer of surplus value is sort of expressed according to King's theory in the different rates of profit between monopoly and non-monopoly capital. And the upshot of all of this is that, according to King, monopoly capital is exclusively, or at least massively based in the global north, whereas non-monopoly capital is the capital that predominates in the global south. And I wonder if so you can see here, this is a photo you've got on the top, what is called an input lab, and that is something that Apple uses in California. And to be quite honest, I don't even know, I can't identify a single thing in this room. It's completely.
Identify the computer.
Yes, okay, there's a laptop. Yeah, but down the bottom. All right, okay, if we're being specific, what's this big thing in the middle? That's my question. I don't know what that is.
It's a station.
It's for inputs, yeah, and
Inputting station.
but below that is Foxconn / Hon High factory. I mean, as you can see, it's a very rudimentary labor process. It's not technically advanced in any sort of straightforward sense. What? They're assembling products. These are reals. Okay, all right, fine. Forgive me for not being in a iPhone factory. Okay. Where was I?
Sorry.
Yeah. So because there's a transfer of surplus from non-monopoly to monopoly capital, and because monopoly capital is based mainly in the global north countries, there will be a transfer of surplus from the global south countries to the global north. And this is the principal mechanism of imperialism in King's account. But there's one point, and this is like quite an innovative point in my view, that sort of needs to be brought into view, and that is the contrast between this form of monopoly and the more traditional forms of monopoly. Because a monopoly that is based on technical superiority of labor processes has like highly specific conditions under which it can be maintained. Because technical superiority is intrinsically difficult to maintain, simply because advances in technique come to be distributed across society over time. So as King writes, the rapid pace of technical change means that technical superiority in any one labor process or series of labor processes is an inadequate basis for long-term domination, because over time, each of these becomes more commonplace and cease to be advanced in relation to competing producers. They will thereby lose their monopolistic character. So what is required, therefore, in order for a monopoly based on sophisticated labor to be maintained is constant innovation in new techniques of production, such that when a previously advanced technique comes to be adopted widely, there's already a new one to replace it, so that the system can keep on chugging, so to speak. And the consequence is that in the contemporary era, research and development, they come to occupy an extremely important place in the global economy, both in terms of private R&D carried out by companies like Apple or whatever, and then also state-sponsored R&D. And you have classical examples here, like the fact that the development of internet was motivated primarily by U.S. Department of Defense spending, but then also in the contemporary era, it's how much money does something like SpaceX get from the government, for instance. So the imperialist states have a central role in sort of propping up the monopoly based on these sophisticated labor processes. So in fact, what King sort of posits is, in contrast to the traditional static form of monopoly, a kind of a dynamic monopoly that sort of can only maintain itself by sort of reproducing itself in different forms. Because the details of what a technically advanced labor process will shift over time. So this constant cycle churning through new advances in production. And this is sort of a vicious cycle in a way, because on the one hand, monopoly capital accrues monopoly profits in virtue of its monopoly position. And that has two effects. On the one hand, it allows the monopoly capital to reinvest their extra surplus in the development of new productive techniques. And then it also drains surplus from the non-monopoly capital sectors, which makes similar investment on their part more difficult. Okay. So the idea here is, okay, I'm going to stop there. We'll go to the next.
So I think it is really important to recognize that in this particular theory, the world is divided into oppressed and oppressor nations on the basis of monopoly and non-monopoly capital, and that is maintained by sophisticated labor and ordinary labor. So that is the way that division is maintained, and that is able to be produced and reproduced in part because of the incumbency of the monopoly capital, but also because of the massive research and development investment spending that is required, that also accrues over time. And that requires, educated workers. It requires a whole society of individuals who are able to create that sophisticated labor process. So that is how Sam's particular theory would fall under the Redan's definition or Lenin's definition of oppressed and oppressor nations. So we're going to turn now to our second theory of imperialism, and that is unequal exchange. And what you'll find is we specifically wanted to talk about unequal exchange because lots of people talk about it, but not a lot of people know what it is. And also because it is explicitly rejecting Lenin's theory of monopolies. Argyri Emmanuel does not think that monopolies really pertain to imperialism as much. So here we're kind of trying to show you a bit of flexibility that you can adopt Lenin's definition that can be part of your anti-imperialist Marxism. However, you can have a completely different theory of imperialism. You don't have to believe in monopoly like Lenin did 100 years ago. So let's get into it. So the idea of unequal exchange has a long and complex history involving the mercantilists, the classical economists like Quesnay, Smith, and Marx. And in the present day, I think it's mostly found in the discipline of ecology. In a simplified form, it can be more for less, or buying cheap, selling dear, or in contemporary Marxist thought, a net transfer of value from global south to global north. So as I said, I'm going to present it as it appears in the thought of Argyri Emmanuel. And I think it's really important to look at this because he presents a systematic explanation of unequal exchange as the way that the world economy is structured. So in ecology, it's often just a statistic. It'll be like, oh, this number of labor hours was transferred. Or in lots of Marxist theories, unequal exchange is just a term that they use as a step within their process. So for Emmanuel, it forms like kind of the entire process. So as I go through this, I want you to keep in mind a few things. The most important thing is that Emmanuel's talking about the formation of prices on the international scale. The price of labor, the price of capital, and the price of commodities. Wages, or the price of labor, are primary in Emmanuel's theory. They are the causal factor in imperialism through their influence on the formation of prices and development, prices of commodities. In terms of profits, they do not have a direct influence on imperialism. And finally, the price of commodity products are essential, as Emmanuel's arguments concern the movement of commodities between countries. So for Emmanuel, he says, quote, one country can only gain something at the expense of another by taking more goods than it provides, or by buying the goods it obtains too cheaply and selling those it provides at too high a price. So here's what I'll be speaking about today. So first, the mobility of factors. 2, the formation of prices. 3, unequal exchange and wages. And 4, the effects of unequal exchange. Oh no, 5 wages as the causal factor. So let's look at the mobility of factors. So recall that we're interested in the formation of international prices of commodity exports and imports. The primary factors which make up the price of a commodity are labor and capital. So what determines the international price of labor and capital? To answer this, Emmanuel turns to competition. When we say that the factors of production, labor and capital, are in a situation of competition, we mean that they are able to move between branches of production and countries. So if a branch has higher wages or higher profits, labor or capital will move into that branch. When labor or capital do move to that branch, the resultant oversupply puts downward pressure on that higher price across time. This means that in a situation of competition, higher prices or lower prices for either of the factors, so higher wages or higher profits, cause mobility that will across time bring those prices back to an average. And that's the same for lower prices. To put it formally, for any factor of production, in this instance, labor or capital, there arises a general long-term equilibrium or average for its price, given a situation of competition. If the factors of production were competitive on an international scale, there would be a tendency towards the formation of an equilibrium price for wages and profits internationally. So what does that mean? For capital, for Emmanuel, it is mobile internationally. It can move between nations. That means that there is a tendency towards an equilibrium price for capital, towards an average rate of profit internationally. So this means that regardless of whether Australian capital is engaged in Australia or Myanmar, or whether Indian capital is engaged in India or Brazil, the profits that all capital can receive tends towards an average rate. It doesn't obviously in every instance mean that you get one number and that's it. And that's the rate, not the amount, the average percentage of profits. So you can immediately see how this conflicts with monopoly theories of imperialism. For Emmanuel, the extent to which there are monopolies is overemphasized by Marxists, and whether or not these monopolies do actually secure super profits lacks evidence for him. And there's a whole bunch of statistical debates on whether or not there is an international average rate of profit or not, which would just be so much fun to talk about, but we're not going to do that today. So let's look at labor. It is obvious that there is no international free movement of labor. There are iron borders around countries, especially the imperial core countries. So as John Smith cites, if the same proportion of people had emigrated from the global south since the Second World War as they left Europe between 1850 and 1920, 800 million people would have moved north, expanding the total population of the developed countries by 70%. In reality, a negligible 0.8% of the workforce of the developing world has migrated to work in the industrial countries. Now, imagine what all those xenophobic Australians would say if we accepted like 800 million people. So this artificially restricted labour market means that there's no international competition with respect to labour, but there is with capital. So consequently, there is no international price for labour. And when wages rise in one country, there's no competition that drives them back down. So what we get is completely disparate wage levels between countries. So while profit has an average rate across these countries, wages do not. So in Sam's book, Healthy Competition, he categorizes the countries in the world based on income brackets. So notice how the bottom 83%, so third world, 2, 3, and 4, of the countries earn between $1 and $11,000 in USD, which is honestly astounding. That's 83% of the world. So there is a stratification of the world based on income, and this does obtain within national boundaries. So according to Emmanuel, and here he is certainly correct, the immobility of labor is institutional. And what that means is it's something that doesn't necessarily obtain given normal capitalism. We could have had the movement of labor, like that was a potential possibility for capitalism to have allowed labor to move, especially across time, right? Like there was so much movement, then there's been so much movement out of Europe. But we just haven't been allowed to move out of the global south. That's just it. Like there could have been movement. There could have been 800 million people moving. So the immobility of labor is institutional, and the resultant international disequilibrium in wages is a creation. It is produced and reproduced outside of the normal mechanisms of capitalism. That doesn't mean it's not part of capitalism or extra economic. It just means that in another world, capitalism would have allowed labor to move, and we wouldn't have really high wages in Australia, which, it could have made sense for it, So labor and capital are the primary factors of production, determining the price of a commodity. What are the effects on prices of the international immobility of labor and the mobility of capital? So first, let's put it simply. For Emmanuel, higher wages result in higher prices of commodities, lower wages in lower commodity prices. Given a situation where wages are higher in the north relative to the south, the northern commodity prices will be higher relative to the southern commodity prices. So since profits always tend towards an average international rate, the effects that profits have on prices does not institutionally differ from one country to another. So because of the price difference between the north and the north has a more favorable terms of trade relative to the south. When I say terms of trade, I mean that the north is able to sell their products and receive a higher amount of money than the south can. And this allows them to buy more of the south's products, which are relatively cheaper. So, for example, if the north can get $100 when it sells a commodity and the south can only get $50, the north can sell one of its commodities and buy two of the south's. And the south has to sell two of its commodities at $50 to buy one northern commodity at $100. So, in a sentence, Emmanuel's unequal exchange can be stated as institutionally higher northern wages mean that northern products are more expensive and that the northern terms of trade is more favorable. So let's substantiate this a bit further. When discussing prices, Emmanuel uses Marx's price of production schemas from Capital Volume 3, which I'll be using today. And I just want to note that Emmanuel kind of ditches these later and uses Truffer, which was just a bit too much for me. And we've had discussions as to whether we should even bring this up or not, but let's see how it goes.
The Strappian stuff.
That's the prices of production.
Yeah, get ready for some hardcore economics. I hope you're really happy for a 6 p.m. hardcore economics.
At 6 p.m., like the final talk, and I do this here. So I just want to clarify, I've been using North and South as global North and global South. So I've just been switching between my terminologies. So let's say that our entire capitalist system is made of two countries, A and B. Within each country, there is the formation of a national equilibrium or average wage, and that's because of the mobility of capital. Between both countries, there's an average rate of profit. Between both countries, there's an average rate of profit, but within each country, there is a wage level. So taken as a whole, there is a formation of an average or equilibrium prices of commodities for each country. So I'm going to show you two scenarios and see the effects on prices. In the first scenario, both labor and capital are mobile between A and B. So that would be in a case where borders went closed. In the second scenario, labor is immobile, so borders are closed, but capital is mobile. So as I go through this, I just want you to remember, ultimately, prices of things are equal to the cost of production plus profit. So I'm going to explain how we calculate cost of production and profit by looking at capital investment, wages, and surplus value. So let's take situation one, where we've got the mobility of both labor and capital. So we have the capacity of there to be an average rate of profit, and also there's no wage inequalities between either of these countries. So I'm going to go through and define the terms as we go. Let's take both these countries, A and B, and in a given year, a certain amount of capital is invested. Okay, so there's no difference between these countries. Both the capital is on a national scale. The total amount of capital invested is 240 units, and these can be any units, but let's call them labor hours or value units. So there's 240 invested for a total of 480 in the entire world system. So this is a world of only 2 countries. Of the total capital invested, a part of it goes into constant capital, meaning machinery, ingredients, but only a part of the constant capital is consumed within the production process. For example, the depreciation in a single year of a machine might be 10%, so only 10% of the value is actually imparted on the goods and services in that year. So in this example, the constant capital imparted on the value of commodities is 50 in each country for a total of 100 in the entire system. Next, a certain amount of labor is paid in wages, or variable capital V. In this example, the wages paid in each country are 60, so there's no difference between them, for a total of 120 units in wages in the entire system. Then, within the production process, surplus value, M, is produced. In both countries, a surplus value of 60 is produced. So once again, no difference between the countries, for a total of 120 in the system. So the total value contained in all the goods made in that year is the sum of the constant capital C, the variable capital or wages V, and the surplus value M. So in both countries, C plus V plus M, 50 plus 60 plus 60 is 170 units of value contained in the goods produced in that year. So in total, the value of all goods produced in the system is 340. Now we get to the cost of production, profit, and price. So those were 3 things I asked you to remember. The cost of production, as it appears to the capitalist, is only the constant capital plus the variable capital. In this example, C plus V is 50 plus 60, or 110. The rate of profit is the total value in the system. So the total surplus value, 120, divided by the total capital invested, 480, which is 25%. The profit, when we finally get to profit, is the rate of profit times the average rate of profit that both the capitals can get internationally times the individual amount of capital that is invested. So 25% times 240 for each country, and we get 60 for both countries, no difference. And then finally the upshot, the price or the cost of production plus the profit for each of these commodities in these countries is 170 for a total of 340. So I think this can seem quite intimidating, and it's like in this really obscure part of Marx that not many people read, but it's actually quite simple. So it's just that from the perspective of the capitalist, the cost of producing an item is a certain amount of capital goods and labor, and the selling price has to cover the cost of production, those capital goods and labor, and a certain amount of profit over the top of it. And it's just about calculating how we get to that cost of production and profit. So finally, the terms of trade is the rate at which 1 unit of product or labor in one country can be exchanged for another unit of product or labor in another country. In this example, if I sell 1A, I get 170 units. If I sell 1B, I get 170 units. Therefore, if I sell 1A, I can buy 1B. So as we can see, given the mobility of labor and therefore the formation of an average wage and the mobility of capital and therefore the formation of a rate of an average rate of profit, the prices of the products are the same in both countries and the terms of trade is equally favorable to both countries. How are we feeling? Are we feeling good? Yeah? Does anyone hate that?
We got one more table.
We got
Let's
one
go.
more. I promise. It'll get better. Just like cry out in the chat, y'all in the chat, if you want to say that you hate me. So now let's go to the second situation, and that is unequal exchange for Emmanuel. So in this example, the total capital invested is the same, and the constant capital invested is also the same. So we still have 240 in both countries and 50 in both countries. However, the wages are 5 times higher in A than they are in B. So the total value produced by the workers is still 120. So the value produced by the workers would cover their wages and the surplus value. So it's 120. But as we know, as good Marxists, the wages or the variable capital basically constitutes the necessary labor time. So if the total value produced by workers is 120, the necessary labor time in A is 100. So what's left over for surplus for the capitalist is 20. And in the second situation, the total value produced is still also 120, but the necessary labor time is 20. And so what's left over for the capitalist is 100. Simple, but that kind of stopped me for a bit. So we still have 170 as C plus B plus M. So the value of the commodities are still the same, and it's still the same in both systems. So then we get to the cost of production. So even though the values are the same in this example as the previous example, and they're the same in both countries, the cost of production is completely different. So the cost of production in A is 150, whereas the cost of production in B is only 70. And in the situation one, it was both at 110. So this is really important. The price is the cost of production plus profit. That's it. So now that the cost of production is completely different because of wages, when we go back to profits, the rate of profit is still the same, nothing's changed. And then we get to actual profits, the same profits, it's still 60. But if we add 170 to 60, we now get a price, 150 to 60, we now get 210 as the prices in A. And in B, we get 70 plus 60. The price is 130. So we get completely different prices. And this is only because of wages. So what does this mean? That means that the prices are completely different. And if I sell 1A on the international market, I can get 210 units. If I sell 1B on the international market, I get 130 units. So I only need to sell 0.6 of my product in A to get a whole product in B. And I need to sell a whole 1.6 of my product in B to just get one single A. So basically, I can just get more B I can get more of A for less of B. Wait, hang on, which way is it?
That's a strange way to put it.
Oh God, that is so confusing. This stuff is really confusing. If you're confused, I was really confused, and I have presented it for you. I have struggled for you to get to this point. But basically, from the perspective of A, I have to sell less of my product to get more of B's product. And from the perspective of B, I have to sell more of my product to get less of A's product. So unequal exchange proper for Emmanuel is this difference in prices caused by wages, not by profits. By difference, I mean the difference between situation one, where wages do converge internationally because of the mobility of labor, and situation two, where labor is immobile and wages are higher in one country over another. In the first situation, there's a parity in prices and the terms of trade is the same. In situation two, there is a disparity in prices and the terms of trade is favorable to the country with higher wages. For Marxists, this constitutes a value transfer, where previously country A and B were exchanging goods that embodied 170 units of labor, and they were getting it at a price of 170. Now they are exchanging commodities which embody 170 units of labor, but they're getting completely different prices off it. Namely, where the country has higher wages, they are able to get more value. So A gets 40 more units of value than its products embody, and B gets 40 less units of value than its products embody. And that is the value transfer that occurs purely on the basis of wages. And I don't know, maybe some Marxists in the room will be thinking, how is this different to the value transfer that occurs due to the organic compositions of capital? If anyone is thinking that, and when I wrote this, Brendan was like, no one's thinking that. The short answer is that the differences in organic compositions are just a part and parcel of the normal functioning of capitalism. But for Emmanuel, the divergence in wages doesn't have to be the case at all. It is not within, it actually, for him, violates the labor theory. So let's get on to the effects of unequal exchange. Secret stuff that I'm not talking about. Given that unequal exchange is about prices, the most obvious effect is on consumption. So if we look at it from a Southern perspective, where Northern wage increases affect the consumer goods of Southern workers, an increase in the price of the Northern product reduces the real wage or purchasing power of the Southern worker. This is the case where the increase in price is direct, for example, in a finished good, or indirect, for example, in an ingredient or part. Where wage increases affect only luxury consumption goods, only the Southern capitalists have less purchasing power. But from the Northern perspective, and this is from our perspective, the situation is different. Northern workers have the higher wages, and on top of that, they are able to consume the now cheaper products because of the low prices of the goods. And this is where Emmanuel's theory just makes like so obvious sense. Like you go through all these really hard yards and you read Marx, and then you get to this and you're like, oh, I talk about this all the time. We talk about outsourcing. We say that, there's been a movement of manufacturing of countries from north to south. And this means that we have access to cheaper consumer goods. And we always say that this is a result of cheap labor. That's it. It's always about wages. We're always talking about this in a very straightforward way, that it is the cheaper labor that allows us to consume these goods at cheaper prices. And the kind of thing I want to add there is that the cheaper labor exists because we keep that labor out of our countries. That's why, according to Emmanuel. And it just seems so simple to me in that sense, but it has to be so complicated. So aside from consumption, it's not shown in the particular diagrams I used today, but an increase in wages in the North reduces the general rate of profit on capital. So take a certain amount of value produced globally in a given year. Let's say, so the total amount of capital produced in the year. Let's say that it's let's say that it's shared between the capitalists and the workers. If the share of value apportioned to the workers goes up, then the share that's apportioned to the capital goes down. That's it. But wage increases in a particular country don't only reduce capital's share in that country. Rather, because there's tendency towards an average rate of profit, the decrease in the share in capital affects capital all across the world. It's evened out so that everyone's share in everyone's average profit goes down, basically. So in simple terms, higher wages in one country cause lower profits for capital globally. And there's two consequences for this. The first is that an increase in only Northern wages, it can affect the tendency of the rate of profit to fall across time for global capital. So it's not just a matter of Northern capital, it's for Southern capital as well. But the second consequence is that a decrease in the rate of profits is not only a problem for the capitalists of the South, but the entire Southern society. Southern capitalists could offset their lower wages by increasing their rate of profit and therefore keeping value in their country. So I forgot to put in the slides, but Emmanuel does this. He does his table, but he says, okay, how much would be required? What rate of profit would be required if they were different for the goods to still be traded at a price of 170, so at parity for both the countries. And in country with the lower wages, the profit would have to be 40%, and the country with the higher wages, the profit would have to be at 8%. So the profit rate would have to be 5 times higher in the global South for them to keep all that value instead of it being transferred out to the North. So as Emmanuel says, the simple rule of market laws and the internal competition of the capitalists remove this extra surplus value to the benefit of the consumers in developed countries. So while an increase in nominal wages in the North does not directly decrease the nominal wages in the South, it can certainly have indirect long-term effects that can whittle away the capacity to increase wages in the future. So, but not just wages. Everything that a country does with surplus value, it's investment spending, it's infrastructure, it's taxation that the government gets from the profits. Everything that goes into development is sort of eroded across time because of that value transfer. So Emmanuel says, quote,
We should probably skip the.
No.
It's nearly 6:20. We're getting late.
no, we're fine.
Are we?
Yeah.
We're finishing at 6:30, yeah?
There's no booking afterwards.
Okay. So but we don't
To
want
be fair, we had like a massive break in the middle.
Yeah, okay. All right.
How is everyone feeling? I feel like everyone's, yeah. No, you have to put your hands up. You have to give me a thumbs up. So basically, whatever the opposition to their own capitalists, it is not at all a matter of indifference to workers in poor countries that increased wages in foreign countries whittle away the profits of their own national capitalists, which can constitute, in any case, a potential subject of bargaining and a factor influencing their own demands for future wage increases. However determined these workers may be to expropriate their own capitalists, they cannot favor an expropriation which would only benefit the working classes of another country. And it's important to really recognize the argument here. Increased northern wages come at the expense of the capitalists of the world. And who cares? I'm not crying tears. But increased northern wages come at the expense of southern workers. Where southern workers are the consumer of northern products, their ability to purchase is affected by high wages. And where the southern workers aren't consumers, their long-term bargaining and the development of their country is affected by the decreased surplus available to the local capital. It is a cumulative, never-ending process. The poorer one is, the more exploited one is. And the more exploited one is, the more impoverished one becomes. As in the relations between proletarians and capitalists within a nation, likewise between countries, poverty conditions, exploitation, and exploitation reproduces through its effects its own conditions. I think I read that out wrong. So what I think is so crucial about this picture is the scope. The way Emmanuel recontextualizes production and consumption on the global scale. Globally, there's a fixed amount of value that is produced in a given year, and the distribution of this value and the subsequent capacity to consume is codependent. Where the capitalist share increases, the working class share decreases. Where one country's share of value increases, the other country's share decreases. For Emmanuel, this means that the United States can be the United States and Sweden can be Sweden only because others, that is the 2 billion, he was writing in the 1970s, 2 billion inhabitants of the third world are not. And the people of today's rich countries can consume all the things that make up their material well-being and which they seem to value only because others use them either very little or not at all. They can reprocess their waste simply because others have nothing to reprocess. Otherwise, the ecological balance would be fatally imperiled. So I'm gonna quickly go through the idea of wages as the independent variable because I feel like my throat's gonna die and everyone else is probably also going to die. But basically, the idea is that wages cause these price changes instead of prices causing wages. In Marxist, terms, we often talk about the fact that there's a value of labor power, which is determined by the prices of all the goods that make up the minimum consumption for a worker. Or, in account of monopoly, capital has extra money or surplus, essentially super profits, which allows them to raise the wages of workers. But for Emmanuel, it's not actually these prices that affect wages that much, because when we go to bargain with our employers, we might refer to the company's increase in revenue, but the actual rise in wages is always implemented relative to the strength of the union, the previous wage, and a socially acceptable increase on that price. So wages are extra economic in the sense that it's sort of a cumulative process and it's about political power rather than prices specifically. So for Emmanuel, prices depend on wages. And this is in contrast to Marxist accounts that often argue that global North countries are wealthier or have more surplus value because they export certain kinds of products. which are always relatively more expensive. For example, countries export manufactured goods or high-tech goods. But for Emmanuel, the goods produced by the North are expensive because the wages are expensive, not because these goods are inherently more expensive. So Emmanuel says, oil itself does not impoverish Arab countries any more than timber has enriched Sweden. It is because oil is produced by people who are paid a wage of pure subsistence that its price is falling continuously as compared with that of manufacturers. And it is because timber happened to be the product of countries such as Sweden, Finland, Canada, that where there's been trade union activity, that blah, 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 blah. So one is not poor because one sells cheaply. One sells cheaply because one is poor. And I think that is such a interesting and important point to make here. Yeah. So that's everything that we want to say about Emmanuel. We do have one more theory to go through.
I think we need to be merciful. I don't think we can do any more. That's my position. What's your position?
What's the vibe? Hey, chat. do we want more economics? Because Brendan's trying to shut me down. What do you guys think? How's everyone feeling? We're good? Do you want to hear more, or you're done? Okay, we've got one really strong proponent. Patnaik.
It's the Patnaiks.
Oh,
Sam doesn't care.
Sam doesn't care.
Amy cares.
So the theory is by Prabhat and Utsa Patnaik, and it's about agricultural goods. Oh, we're getting give us the goods. Give me more theory. Okay. Brendan outed as counter-revolutionary. Yeah. He literally does not want you to hear the theories.
How long is this going to go?
Another 5-10 minutes.
Okay.
All right. I will try to cut it down as I speak. The problem I find is when I start cutting it down, I start ad-libbing, which means I actually add way more stuff.
Yeah, that's the issue. But this theory is important because it explains how you get your fruits and vegetables.
Yeah.
So,
who wants to hear about fruits and vegetables?
Yes.
All right. We're getting strong support for Team Nandini in the chat. So we're gonna do it. And I'm going to try and do it quickly because my voice is also about to die. So the last theory, which we are going to touch on in spite of Brendan's counter-revolutionary tendencies, is by Utsa and Prabhat Patnaik. So there's really interesting parallels between the Patnaiks and Emmanuel's theory. So they both take a fixed amount of production in a given year and see how that's allocated. They both care about the immobility of labor, the prices of commodities, and the purchasing power. But the big difference between this theory and the last two theories is agriculture, the fact that they look at agricultural goods specifically. So the starting point of the Patnaik's argument is capitalist consumption and production requires agricultural commodities, which are primarily only able to be produced by the global south. And they also talk about minerals, but we're only going to be talking about agriculture.
Minerals like
today.
oil, crucially.
Yeah. Whoops. In the temperate regions of the world, and this includes, in my fancy circles, North America, all of Europe, most of Western Asia, Japan, and basically us down the bottom, due to climatic factors, agricultural commodities either cannot be produced at all, cannot be produced in the required quantities for consumption under capitalism, and importantly, consumption by the northern countries under capitalism, or can only be produced during some parts of the year, so mostly in winter. Let's look at their evidence. So this is a table of imports as a percentage of domestic production for all food groups, and this is for high-income countries. The red boxes are anywhere where the imports make up more than 50% of domestic production. The orange boxes are where the imports make up 20 to 50% of domestic production. So you can see that in these temperate high-income countries, the primary agricultural products are cereals, sugar, dairy, and meat products, including offals, animal fats, eggs, and milk. On the whole, the temperate regions are massive importers of pulses, vegetables, fruits, tea, coffee, spices, fish, and seafood. For almost all the countries, there are many crops which there is simply no domestic production of, where imports make more than 100%. So there's some quite funny ones where it tends towards infinity, and there's some that are just absolutely crazy numbers. and note that the agricultural production that does exist is actually primarily in the United States, which we all know is a heavily subsidized agricultural market. And the Patnaiks point out that the US even has a lower agricultural productivity than China or India. So
Even with the subsidies.
even with the subsidies. So this is what the situation of production and importing for agricultural commodities are for high-income countries that are in the temperate regions. For the tropical low-income countries, there are far less imports. Like, just look at the comparison between the boxes here. You know, it's actually quite crazy. So it's mostly only sugar and vegetable oils and some animal products like fats and milk. But on the whole, imports make up largely less than 20% and mostly less than 10% of domestic production. So you can see just how many zeros there are on this table. Now, the argument is not that the tropics have comparative advantage in producing these goods, but that only the tropical regions can produce these goods, because comparative advantage requires both countries to be able to produce them. But the Patnaiks argue that only these countries in these tropical environments are able to produce most of these goods. So the Patnaiks argue that there's a fixed amount of supply of these agricultural commodities. For manufacturers' goods, there's no immediate fixed supply because capitalist economies hardly ever even reach their capacity. But there's a certain amount of arable land available to produce agricultural product, and that's fixed. We haven't as yet invented more land. And the productive capacity of this land mass isn't fixed per se, but it requires land augmenting measures to increase its capacity. And this includes state action, so subsidies, remunerative prices to peasants, appropriate water availability, better farm practices, high-yielding seeds, et cetera, et cetera. Two, it requires cooperative and collecting farming price practices, which create opportunities for yield raising through multiple cropping, which typically requires, again, irrigation, massive estate infrastructure. And three, removing landlordism and the rent barrier to which it gives rise, and which reduces the incentives of the part of both the landlords and tenants to introduce better farm practices. So the productive capacity of the land mass that we have today is fixed in the absence of these land augmenting measures. So have these measures been in place in the tropical south? So basically, to elide a bit, under the colonial policy, no, there was just absolutely no investment spending unless it helped the colonial power. But there was a period of dirigism in the post-liberation era where the newly elected governments were able to have somewhat more social policies. They were able to do a little bit more investment spending. But the Patnaiks argue that from the 1970s onward, we have been under the neoliberal regime, which is characterized by sound finance and fiscal responsibility, where the state becomes far more tied to promoting the exclusive interests of the corporate financial elite. So government expenditure itself is discouraged, and where it isn't spent, it goes into tax concessions for corporate financial elite. So, for example, in India, even large dam and irrigation projects actually were there to allow the profits of the corporate elite instead of actually helping irrigation. Like, a lot of these dam projects were just absolute shit and actually destroyed the environment instead of helping the environment. So in addition to this, the government's support for the peasantry, including tax breaks, cheap credits, subsidies, is completely cut. And you can think, again, in India, the case of the recent Indian farmers' protests, like an attempt to neoliberalize the farming sector that has been going along for a long time. So in the absence of the land augmentation, the supply of agricultural commodities becomes more or less fixed. So what is the effect of this? The Patnaiks argue that this means the price of these agricultural commodities face the threat of perpetually increasing supply price. Sorry, I just a bit frozen. Okay. So basically, the supply price increases because supply remains fixed while demand increases. So in a situation where demand keeps increasing without an increase in supply, the price of the agricultural goods keeps increasing. Now, this is not short-term inflation that will go away. It's a long-term, never-ending inflation. And they have this whole argument about how this actually destabilizes the money in the entire capitalist money system, because basically in long-term never-ending inflation destabilizes the value of money and how wealth holders will change their asset preference. But I'm not going to say that. I'm just going to say that that is a very bad situation and we should avoid it.
I think we can all agree that infinite inflation is a bad.
Yes, infinite inflation equals bad. So how do we avoid infinite inflation? I said inflammation. If supply cannot increase, demand must decrease. And here the Patnaiks argue that the primary method for reducing demand is income deflation, a curtailment of the purchasing power of the global South population so that out of a relatively unchanging output of the fixed tropical landmass, they are obliged to release more and more goods for us in the metropolis. There are two mechanisms for releasing those goods. Either the actual goods that themselves are no longer able to be afforded by the southern workers, and those goods can then be reallocated to the northern workers, or else land that was previously producing for the consumption of the southern workers as a result of the fall in demand by southern consumers can be reallocated to produce crops for the north. And we see that all the time. So in general, the total demand is able to be met by the restriction of the demand in the south to meet the demand in the north. And this is all to avoid the threat to the capitalist money system, which I totally touched on. So in the colonial period, this income deflation was imposed through the state infrastructure, but in the neoliberal period, it's through these more like step back economic mechanisms. So for the Patnaiks, this mechanism is the large surplus labor in the global South countries. So basically the argument is, to put it really quickly,
one of the mechanisms.
The most important. The argument is that the idea that there is a surplus labor, a reserve army of labor is well documented, and it's a pretty classical Marxist concept. But the history of that is basically that capitalism destroyed petty production in the early pre-capitalist relations. This released a huge amount of population, and that those people constituted the reserve army of labor. But ultimately, they were able to be reincorporated into industry. This belies a truth, and that is that the reserve army of labor did not just magically get reincorporated into capitalism, in the 1850s. It left Europe in millions of people. And we have those statistics that if the same number of people left Europe as they did, in the early 20th century, we would have to have 800 million people leaving the global South. So the main mechanism of clearing the reserve army of labor for Europe was migration. But this has simply not been the case for the global South. People have not been allowed to migrate, instead 0.8% of the workforce since 1945, which means that for the Patnaiks, there are two reserve army of labors. One in the global north, which is kept at our Nehru at our 5% of unemployed, right? And one in the global south, where there is, as I showed you at the very start, a massive share of informal employment, people who are teetering on the edge. In India, for example, 75 to 89% of people in the informal economy. And these are people who basically make up that reserve army of labor. They're going in and out of employment and unemployment. They have no labor rights or anything like that. So for the Patnaiks, these people are the price takers. They are the people who basically have to live on a subsistence minimum forever. The toiling populations within the Southern Reserve Army of Labor and those who are forever teetering on the edge of it are the price takers, those who are incapable of raising their money prices even when they are faced with a rise in the price in other sectors. For these producers, wages are kept at a subsistence minimum. With fluctuations in the prices of essential agricultural goods, they cannot increase their money wages. They simply have to forego their meals. And I think we see a lot of small business owners today saying, I'm so sorry, I have to raise my prices because of inflation. Someone at the bottom of that chain, and that is namely everyone in the global South, cannot raise their prices because of inflation and apologize for it. They just have to skip meals. That's it. And this is just a spontaneous mechanism of capital. It's not an evil plan that someone puts into effect. It's just that the people at the bottom are forced to pay for what they can. As the Patnaiks calculate, the percentage of Indian workers who do not meet their minimum daily caloric requirements has actually risen from 1993 to 2012. And And I'm sorry, but this is such a devastating and humbling statistic. We're talking about almost 70% of people who do not meet their minimum requirements. It's not a cost of living crisis. It's not workers having to eat crap food because there's no time to cook. This is people going hungry every single day of their lives. And according to the Patnaik's theory, it's so that capitalism can maintain itself, while the North eats itself sick and throws away the rest. That is the reality of the situation. So for the Patnaiks, and I did this really quickly, I'm sorry, we can see that the world is divided by those upon whom income deflation is imposed, the South, and those upon whom it is not imposed, the North. And the oppression is one where the agricultural product of the South is taken off the plate of the Southern workers and put on the plate of the Northern workers. And this is to maintain the value of money in the capitalist monetary system. So that's the very last theory we had. And in conclusion, I didn't have a conclusion, but I just wanted to say that we have that definition that we brought to you at the start, which is the division of the world into oppressed and oppressor nations. And we've shown you 3 different theories which show how this is maintained on a global scale by completely different mechanisms. So in Sam's case, it was oppression on the axis of the complexity of labor, and the oppression was based on monopoly prices where profits were higher, so surplus was able to be transferred. In Emmanuel's theory, it was based on the immobility of labor and the subsequent differences in the prices of products that are exported, and therefore the surplus that is able to be transferred from south to north as a result of the labor and wages. And in the final one, it's about agricultural products. It's the fact that agricultural supply is fixed and the oppression is based on those who don't eat and those who do eat and also throw a lot of it away. So those are our 3 completely different theories, which are all completely compatible with Lenin's definition. And that, for us, in this very short talk, is the basis of Lenin's anti-imperialism Marxism.